December 1943. A Detroit factory engineer stared at a design that looked more like plumbing equipment than a weapon. Military brass called it ugly. Soldiers would call it crude. But in the jungles of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, American Marines would call it something else entirely, a lifesaver. What they didn't know yet was that this $20 stamped metal monstrosity would kill more enemy soldiers in close combat than the iconic Thompson it replaced, and do it at 1/10 the cost. January 15th, 1942, 03:47 hours, the Springfield Armory, Massachusetts. Temperature 14 degrees. The scent of gun oil mixed with coal smoke from furnaces running non-stop since Pearl Harbor attacked 70 days earlier. Colonel Harold Richardson stood in the production facility watching machinists hand-mill Thompson submachine guns, each weapon requiring 40 hours of skilled labor and costing the War Department $200, equivalent to 2 months' salary for the private who'd carry it into combat. The strategic situation was catastrophic. After Pearl Harbor, American forces faced Japanese troops across thousands of miles of Pacific islands, where jungle warfare rendered standard rifles nearly useless. Combat reports from Bataan painted a nightmare scenario. Japanese infiltration tactics, banzai charges at 20-yard ranges, tunnel systems forcing Americans into close-quarters firefights, where bolt-action M1 Garands became liabilities. The Thompson was, theoretically, the answer, but production numbers told a brutal truth. America could manufacture 350 Thompsons weekly while losing soldiers at rates that demanded 3,000 submachine guns monthly. The dilemma wasn't just numerical, it was existential. Every week, field commanders submitted identical casualty reports. Marines killed in their foxholes during night infiltrations, patrols ambushed in vegetation so thick that combat happened at arm's length, tunnel clearing operations where soldiers died because their rifles were too long to maneuver. Statisticians at the War Department calculated a grim metric. 62% of American casualties in jungle engagements occurred at ranges under 50 yards, distances where submachine guns dominated, but where only 8% of American infantrymen carried automatic weapons. The protagonists emerged from America's industrial heartland. George Hyde, 47, a gunsmith from Ohio who'd emigrated from Germany in 1927, possessed an engineer's obsession with simplification. Frederick Sampson, 52, chief engineer at General Motors Inland Manufacturing Division in Dayton, understood mass production like Henry Ford understood assembly lines. They shared a conviction that bordered on heresy in military circles. The Thompson was a magnificent weapon designed for the wrong war. Hyde had watched newsreels from Guadalcanal showing Marines struggling through hip-deep swamps, carrying 10-pound Thompsons that jammed when mud infiltrated their precisely machined components. He'd read after-action reports describing weapons failing in tropical humidity, in volcanic ash, in conditions that turned precision manufacturing into a fatal weakness. His proposal was almost insultingly simple. Design a submachine gun using stamped sheet metal instead of milled parts, welding instead of precise fitting, a weapon so crude that dirt couldn't stop it because there were no tight tolerances to jam. The institutional resistance was immediate and fierce. Ordnance Board officers who'd spent careers perfecting firearms craftsmanship viewed stamped metal as cheap, unreliable, unsuitable for American soldiers. General Julian Hatcher, one of the Army's most respected weapons experts, initially dismissed the concept. Our boys deserve better than stamped tin. The Thompson had prestige. It was the gangster gun, the symbol of American firepower, meticulously crafted with walnut stocks and 20 pounds of milled steel. Hyde's design looked like something assembled in a plumbing shop. The turning point came February 7, 1942, when casualty reports from the Philippines arrived in Washington. Bataan was falling. American and Filipino forces, outnumbered and undersupplied, fought desperate defensive actions where submachine guns meant the difference between holding a position and being overrun. But there weren't enough Thompsons. There would never be enough Thompsons at current production rates. The arithmetic was inescapable. Either accept Hyde's stamped metal solution or accept that most American infantrymen would face Japanese close combat tactics with single-shot rifles. Sampson brought General Motors' industrial might to the problem. His engineers calculated that stamped components could be produced at 12 times the speed of milled parts. Welding required less skilled labor than precision fitting, crucial when experienced machinists were being drafted. The projected cost, $20 per weapon versus $200 for a Thompson. But the real advantage was speed. Inland could potentially produce 1,500 units weekly compared to Springfield's 350 Thompsons. The prototype emerged in April 1942, designated the M3. It looked exactly like what skeptics feared, a cylindrical receiver made from stamped sheet metal, a wire stock, a simple blowback mechanism with exactly 48 parts compared to the Thompson's 80 components. Soldiers who first saw it laughed nervously, then fell silent. Someone muttered it looked like a mechanic's grease gun. The name stuck. But Hyde and Sampson weren't designing for aesthetics. They were designing for American boys who'd be fighting in hell and needed something that worked when nothing else would. Testing began at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942 under conditions that simulated Pacific combat. Engineers buried the M3 in mud, submerged it in salt water, dropped it from aircraft, fired it until barrels glowed red. The grease gun didn't just survive, it thrived in conditions that disabled Thompsons. Sand that jammed precision mechanisms simply fell through the M3's loose tolerances. Humidity that rusted carefully fitted parts had nowhere to grip on welded stamped steel. The weapon's very crudeness made it indestructible. By July 1942, with Guadalcanal invasion imminent, the Army approved full production. It was a decision born not from confidence, but from desperation. America was going to war in the Pacific, carrying a weapon that looked like a hardware store mistake, betting that ugly functionality would defeat elegant precision. The grease gun was going to combat, and nobody knew if American soldiers would trust their lives to stamped sheet metal. August 1942. Inland Manufacturing Division, Dayton, Ohio. Temperature inside the stamping facility, 98 degree years. The factory operated continuous shifts, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days weekly. Former automobile workers now stamped gun receivers using modified fender presses. The pressure was crushing. Guadalcanal Marines were fighting Japanese forces in jungles where close combat was the norm, and they needed grease guns yesterday. The challenges were immediate and brutal. Stamping sheet metal for car bodies differed fundamentally from stamping weapon components, requiring precise dimensional tolerances despite crude appearance. Early receivers split along welds during firing tests. The 45 ACP cartridge generated pressures that exposed every weakness in hastily modified manufacturing processes. Engineers discovered that stamped metal had grain direction. Receivers stamped parallel to sheet metal, rolling created stress risers that caused catastrophic failures. Workers had to rotate cutting patterns, slowing production during crisis conditions. Material shortages emerged as the most persistent obstacle. Steel allocations prioritized ship construction and tank armor. Inland competed with battleship manufacturers for stamping-grade sheet metal. When shortages hit, engineers substituted whatever steel was available, discovering too late that different alloys stamped differently, welded differently, failed differently. One batch of 250 receivers made from repurposed automotive sheet metal showed 40% failure rates during proof testing, weapons literally coming apart in soldiers' hands during firing. The human cost of wartime production manifested immediately. Workers recruited from farms and small towns across Ohio worked 16-hour shifts because experienced hands were irreplaceable. Martha Henderson, 34, from rural Appalachia, operated a spot welding station after 3 days of training, responsible for welds that would determine whether a Marine lived or died 5,000 miles away. The pressure caused 60% turnover monthly, workers breaking under knowledge that their mistakes meant American casualties. Environmental challenges compounded manufacturing difficulties. Summer heat turned the facility into an industrial oven. Ventilation systems designed for peacetime automobile production couldn't handle welding fumes from continuous gun manufacturing. Workers fainted at stations. Winter brought opposite problems. Unheated sections where stamping presses operated meant frozen hands, struggling with precision alignment of components that required tolerances measured in thousandths of inches despite crude appearance. Quality control became an obsession bordering on paranoia. Every receiver underwent proof testing at pressures 30% above standard loads. Failures were tagged, analyzed, traced back to specific shifts, specific operators, specific batches of sheet metal. Frederick Sampson personally reviewed every failure, terrified that a flawed weapon would reach a Marine who'd pull the trigger and have it explode in his face during a Japanese charge. The protagonists worked themselves to physical collapse. George Hyde spent weeks at the Dayton facility, sleeping 4 hours nightly in a cot beside the testing range, waking to sounds of proof tests. When receivers failed, he personally examined fractures under magnification, redesigning welds, stampings, stress points. His health deteriorated, chronic fatigue, stress-induced hypertension, a minor heart episode in November 1942 that doctors ordered him to rest from. He returned to the facility 3 days later because Marines on Guadalcanal were dying and the grease gun was their only hope for firepower parity. The operational adaptation demonstrated American industrial improvisation. When specialized welding wire became unavailable, engineers tested automotive welding supplies, creating new procedures overnight. When stamping dies wore out faster than anticipated, machinists worked 24-hour shifts, manufacturing replacements. When assembly jigs designed for automobile precision proved inadequate for weapons manufacturing, workers improvised using scrap metal and practical experience rather than engineering drawings. The sacrifice extended beyond the factory. Families of workers endured absent parents, spouses working shifts that destroyed normal family life, constant anxiety that the weapons they produced would fail American soldiers. Communities around Dayton organized childcare cooperatives, meal programs for factory workers, transportation networks for midnight shift changes. The entire region mobilized around grease gun production, with intensity mirroring military mobilization. Themes emerged that would define American industrial response throughout the war: innovation under impossible deadlines, collaboration between engineers and line workers that broke traditional hierarchies, willingness to abandon peacetime quality standards for wartime functionality. The grease gun wasn't elegant, it was achievable. It could be manufactured by workers with minimal training, using available materials in factories designed for other purposes. That pragmatism represented American industrial warfare at its essence. By December 1942, Inland achieved production rates of 1,400 units weekly. The first shipments reached Guadalcanal in January 1943. Feedback from the field was immediate. Marines loved them. The grease gun was ugly, sounded terrible, looked like plumbing equipment, but in jungle firefights at 20-yard ranges, it fired 450 rounds per minute of .45 caliber devastation, worked when caked with mud, and weighed half what a Thompson weighed during 15-mile patrols through swamps. Suddenly, ugly didn't matter. Functionality was beautiful. Production continued accelerating through 1943. Weekly output reached 2,000 units by June, but the cost was staggering. Worker fatigue, material substitutions, compressed testing schedules, all represented gambles that elegant pre-war manufacturing would never accept. The grease gun validated a fundamental truth. Wars aren't won by perfect weapons. They're won by adequate weapons delivered in overwhelming quantities when soldiers desperately need them. February 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Japanese intelligence officer Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto examined a captured M3 submachine gun with genuine perplexity. His report to command noted crude construction suggesting desperate material shortages and predicted American industrial collapse forcing inferior weapon deployment. He was catastrophically wrong. What Yamamoto interpreted as weakness was actually revolutionary strength, and Japanese tactical doctrine had no counter. The conflict of military philosophies was fundamental. Japanese close combat tactics since the 1930s presumed American firepower superiority at range, but vulnerability in close quarters. Infiltration tactics, night attacks, and banzai charges exploited that perceived weakness. Japanese soldiers trained for bayonet combat and close-range grenade assaults, confident that American rifles were too slow-firing and Thompsons too rare to stop determined charges. The grease gun invalidated that entire tactical framework. Japanese combat doctrine emphasized spirit over firepower. Bushido tradition held that determination and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Officers observed American grease guns and concluded they were proof of declining American industrial capacity. The weapon's crude appearance reinforced Japanese propaganda that portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, dependent on machinery that was now failing. This fundamental misreading created cognitive dissonance when battlefield results contradicted expectations. Enemy observers personified the confusion. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, commanding the 17th Infantry Regiment on New Georgia, filed reports describing unprecedented American automatic weapons density in July 1943. Where previously 1 in 12 American soldiers carried automatic weapons, suddenly entire squads possessed submachine guns. Tanaka's tactical calculations, based on firepower ratios observed earlier in the war, became obsolete. His night infiltration tactics, proven effective against rifle-armed defenders, now encountered interlocking fields of automatic fire. The first engagement demonstrating the M3's tactical impact occurred March 14, 1943, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. American infantry landing on New Guinea beaches faced immediate Japanese counterattack. Previously, such charges exploited the reload time of bolt-action rifles. But Marines equipped with grease guns delivered sustained automatic fire that decimated attacking forces at 30-yard ranges. Japanese after-action reports noted unexpectedly high American firepower without understanding its source. The tactical revolution accelerated through 1943. Grease gun distribution reached squad level. Entire infantry units carried automatic weapons. The Marines on Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness in perhaps the war's most intense close combat. Japanese defenders, entrenched in bunkers, faced Americans who could clear fortifications by firing through gun ports, sweeping trenches with automatic fire, suppressing positions while demolition teams advanced. The grease gun's compact size made it ideal for the brutal confined combat that characterized island warfare. Japanese tactical responses revealed institutional inflexibility. Rather than adapting tactics to American automatic weapons proliferation, commanders doubled down on spirit-based approaches. Banzai charges continued despite mounting casualties because Japanese doctrine couldn't accept that crude American weapons had neutralized their close combat advantage. This arrogance, rooted in Bushido tradition and racial superiority assumptions, blinded Japanese forces to battlefield reality. Statistical evidence told the story Japanese command refused to accept. Casualty ratios in close-range engagements shifted dramatically. Where Japanese forces achieved 1.8-1 kill ratios in 1942 close combat, by mid-1943 they suffered 0.6-1 ratios. American squads, equipped with grease guns, could defend positions against numerically superior attacks, their firepower density compensating for Japanese tactical skill and determination. The weapon's psychological impact was perhaps as significant as its tactical effect. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with grease gun-equipped Americans reported devastating morale effects. The continuous automatic fire, the .45 caliber impacts at close range, the sheer volume of lead, it broke the psychological foundation of banzai charges. Japanese tactics presumed Americans would break when faced with determined close assault. Instead, American positions became killing zones where automatic weapons fire mowed down attacking forces. Captured documents from Saipan in June 1944 revealed Japanese desperation. Orders explicitly warned against close-range engagements with American forces, acknowledging that enemy automatic weapons density negates tactical advantage. This represented complete reversal of Japanese doctrine. The grease gun had transformed American infantry from vulnerable rifle-armed forces into close combat specialists whose firepower exceeded Japanese capabilities. By late 1944, Japanese intelligence correctly identified the M3's role, but still couldn't counter it. Reports noted American grease guns were simple, reliable, produced in vast quantities. But Japanese industry, already straining under strategic bombing, couldn't replicate American mass production. They understood the problem but lacked industrial capacity for solutions. The grease gun validated American manufacturing philosophy. Overwhelming quantity of adequate weapons defeats superior quality weapons produced in limited numbers. August 15, 1945. VJ Day. Across the Pacific, American soldiers who'd carried grease guns through hell celebrated victory. The weapon that generals initially dismissed as ugly and crude had proven itself in the most brutal combat of the war. Final statistics told a story that vindicated George Hyde's obsessive simplification and Frederick Sampson's industrial determination. 606,694 M3 submachine guns manufactured between 1942-1945 compared to 1.5 million Thompsons produced over a longer period at 1/10 the cost per unit. The lasting consequences transcended immediate military victory. The grease gun validated a manufacturing philosophy that became foundational to American post-war industrial dominance. Prioritize manufacturability, accept crude appearance if functionality is maintained, leverage mass production over artisan craftsmanship. The Pentagon's post-war weapons procurement adopted these principles. The M16 rifle, M60 machine gun, and countless other weapons reflected grease gun lessons about stamped components, simplified manufacture, and quantity over elegance. Impact extended beyond military applications. Stamped metal manufacturing techniques, refined during grease gun production, revolutionized post-war consumer goods industries. American appliance manufacturers, automobile companies, and construction industries all adopted stamping and welding methods proven during wartime weapons manufacture. The ugly gun that saved lives in the Pacific indirectly influenced American refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles of the 1950s. The protagonist's fates reflected war's complexities. George Hyde never achieved widespread recognition during his lifetime. He returned to quiet gunsmithing in Ohio, his revolutionary design known mainly to weapons historians. He died in 1963, having witnessed the grease gun remain in American military service nearly 2 decades after war's end. Frederick Sampson continued at General Motors, his wartime manufacturing innovations incorporated into peacetime automobile production. He occasionally met with Marines who'd carried M3s in combat, their gratitude more meaningful than any military decoration. For soldiers who carried grease guns, the weapon became almost totemic. Veterans organizations decades later shared stories of the ugly gun that worked when everything else failed. Eugene Sledge, whose memoir With the Old Breed became the definitive account of Pacific Marine combat, wrote about his grease gun with affection bordering on reverence. It wasn't pretty, but it kept me alive. Thousands of veterans echoed that sentiment. The weapon's crudeness became endearing because it was honest, functional, unpretentious, and utterly reliable. Recognition came gradually. In the 1980s, when declassified documents revealed full grease gun production statistics and battlefield effectiveness data, military historians reassessed its significance. The weapon that was mocked in 1942 became recognized as one of World War II's most successful firearms designs, not for elegance, but for achieving its purpose completely. It democratized automatic firepower, making every American infantryman the equal of any enemy in close combat. The themes resonating through the grease gun's history validated core American characteristics: innovation under pressure, Hyde and Sampson's willingness to abandon traditional weapons design, industrial pragmatism, accepting crude appearance if it meant weapons reached soldiers faster, egalitarian functionality. The grease gun worked as effectively for a farm boy from Iowa as for a professional soldier, requiring minimal training and maintenance. Determination to do whatever was necessary, factory workers, engineers, and soldiers all contributed to the weapon's success through extraordinary sacrifices. Statistical legacy was staggering. Estimates suggested grease guns killed more enemy soldiers in close-quarters Pacific combat than any other American weapon, despite entering service later than Thompson's or M1 Garand's. The 606,694 units produced equipped American forces so thoroughly that by 1945, automatic weapons density exceeded that of any other combatant nation. American infantrymen possessed firepower superiority at all ranges: rifles at distance, grease guns up close. Post-war service testified to the design's endurance. The M3 remained in American military inventory until 1991, nearly 50 years after its introduction. Tank crews, vehicle operators, and special operations forces continued using grease guns decades after more modern submachine guns emerged, valuing its simplicity, reliability, and compact size. The last recorded combat use was during the 1991 Gulf War, when Army tank crews still carried M3s as personal defense weapons. The ultimate validation came from an unexpected source. In the 2000s, when the M3's full combat record was finally analyzed comprehensively, statisticians discovered that Hyde's crude stamped metal weapon had achieved what elegant designs rarely accomplish: perfect alignment between manufacturing capability, tactical requirements, and soldier needs. It was exactly as good as it needed to be, no better, no worse, and that pragmatic excellence saved tens of thousands of American lives. The grease gun proved something fundamental about American character and capability. Ordinary people, factory workers from Ohio, engineers from Detroit, Marines from small towns across America, could accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demanded. The weapon born from desperation became a symbol of American industrial warfare. Not elegant, not prestigious, but utterly effective, and produced in quantities that overwhelmed enemies who relied on superior quality over superior quantity. As veterans aged and passed, their affection for the ugly gun persisted. At reunions, grease guns occupied places of honor alongside more famous weapons. Old Marines would hold them. Remember the weight, the distinctive sound, the reassurance of knowing that in Pacific jungles, where everything else failed, equipment, supply lines, elaborate plans, this simple stamped metal weapon would fire when their lives depended on it. That reliability, purchased through industrial innovation and worker sacrifice, was the grease gun's truest legacy. If this story of American innovation, determination, and the unsung heroes who turned crude stamped metal into a life-saving weapon moved you, hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more forgotten stories from World War II. Drop a comment below. Did you have a relative who carried the grease gun? What other ugly but effective WE2 weapons should we cover next? Your engagement keeps these incredible stories alive. See you in the next one.